And so here we are. All right, so we are only a few days away from the very first X-Culture Research Hackathon. And I'm not sure if hackathon is the best word, so maybe we'll come up with a better one in time. But the idea there is that we will spend those several days actively working on papers. And so there are several expected benefits to that format. One, for, I wouldn't call lazy people like myself, but for people who tend to put off things all the time, like I have all kinds of ideas for papers, there is always something seemingly more important. My hope is that by dedicating a few days to research only, that will give that kind of jolt, that initial push, so that finally the idea will be crystallized and refined enough to become a paper, or at least a draft of a paper. And then I will have that as a first step towards finishing the paper, because otherwise I may just never start. But more importantly, the idea there is that we will spend several days constantly brainstorming ideas, sharing ideas, receiving feedback. In this particular first meeting, we don't have the editors of journals yet, but if it goes well and we do it again in the future, maybe we'll even invite editors of the journals so that they can provide immediate feedback. Like if you submitted it to my journal, this is what I would say. Maybe even commitment, that if you do it as you described here in the presentation, I promise to publish it or something like that, or at least give it a preferential treatment. And so then the same thing is, idea exchange hopefully will lead to better ideas. I have some ideas for new papers, but maybe once I talk to everyone in this group, maybe they will direct me in a more promising, more fruitful direction. And then more importantly, even maybe somebody will say, actually, you know what, I like that idea, let's work together. And so instead of me just putting it off and just having it in my head, now I have an idea, I have a co-author, we worked on something. So the hope is that by the end of these few days, we will have a pretty clear idea as to what we're working on, one paper, maybe even a few. So co-authors, if there are any, I mean, it's perfectly fine to keep working alone, but if there will be several people or one person who wants to work with you and you want to work with him or her, I guess we'll have co-authors. Then we'll have some feedback on the idea. Then we'll have some initial results. Then we'll present the results and get some feedback on the results, and maybe even have time to refine it. In this particular first meeting, we don't have the editors of journals yet, but if it goes well and we do it again, now recording, we'll invite editors of the journals so that they can provide immediate feedback. Yeah, so let me switch that feedback. So that's the idea. And so I sent you yesterday the final program for the hackathon. The plan was to have both research, but also a social program in place, so that people there are not only presenting and listening to each other, but also meet each other at a more personal level, so kind of develop more close, friendly social ties. Those of you who remember, when we go to conferences and, if we just go to each other's presentations, that's one thing. But if we, like in Dubai, for example, do the safari together and then, watch a belly dancer and then maybe, go to some crazy places where we shouldn't go, or, climb Burj Khalifa, all of a sudden people become more of kind of friends rather than just simply, someone I saw a presentation by. And so that's the hope. So here we will have also a rich social program. So we'll have all kinds of field trips. We'll have breakfast, lunch, dinner together. The event organizers will even have, I believe, one of the evenings they will have a class on salsa and then a competition. So whoever's, who is the best salsa dancer. And obviously, as serious researchers, you don't have to do all of that. But, if you would like to, we will have that opportunity. Then we will have some program that will be specifically dedicated to the students, which you don't have to participate in. But instead, you can use all that time for some concentrated work. I mean, obviously, it doesn't have to be all presentations after presentation. So we'll have a few hours every day when we work as a whole group. But then, obviously, we'll need some time when we go to our own laptops and just quietly do some research, run some results or tests, download some maybe papers to see what others are talking about that and stuff like that. So we'll meet several times a day, every day, and we'll have ample opportunities to discuss what we're working on. But then hopefully there will be also enough quiet times when each can work on the paper alone or maybe with a co-author. So that's as far as the general idea for the event. And we'll see how we will do it in the future. So this time it's mixed with the X-Culture Symposium. And so we'll have hackathon, then we have some event, like go, for example, to the Port of Miami, then we'll have lunch together, talk some more about research. They will put us always at the same tables, so we'll have opportunities to talk about it informally, and then we'll have some presentations and things like that. In the future, depending on how this one goes, we can either stay with the same format, where it's a few sessions, 1 or 2 sessions every day in addition to the conference, or maybe we'll do it before the conference, like 3-4 days dedicated to this and nothing else, and then people stay for a couple more days for the actual conference, and then continue working together. So we'll have to see how this goes and decide together. So that's for the general idea. Anyone has any thoughts or plans about that, or suggestions maybe for how to do it better before we get into the data and technical stuff? Or, well, if you have any suggestions, both before the event starts, but also even more so once it starts, we are flexible. So we have some times allocated to us, we have some meeting space, we have some computer labs, but at the same time, you know, if at some point we realize that what we planned is not the best way forward, we can always change it, and we can always, you know, do whichever way we see is the best way forward, because it's the first time, we don't really know what to expect. No,
I think it looks excellent. It looks very good.
Yeah. All right. Yes. Let's hopefully it will work fine. But you know, let's see how it goes. And as I said, changes are possible. So anything you think is not optimal, we can make those changes on the fly. Now, what I wanted to share with you today is to show you how to access the data and how to download the data. And I will also show you very quickly what we're trying to do. And from the technical point, not everything works, but then at the same time, some other things work very well, and probably maybe even better than what we have in mind for the future. So I'm going to switch off my camera for a second and instead share my screen and show you on the screen what we have here. So we have this folder that you all have access to, which is called Hackathon Data. Can you see my screen just to make sure?
I can.
Okay. So and you see the folder, right? Because once I show it, the folder for the whole screen, I don't see what you see. Okay.
Yeah.
So the original data exists in a collection of Excel files. At some point, we put everything in one file, but that didn't work very well because the data represent fundamentally different levels of analysis. So some data represent the individual level of analysis. So those would be basically information about the people. So we would have, you know, age and gender and what they said on it, you know, for example, readiness test and their weekly comments and whatever else, you know, either what they say or what we know about them. So all those individual surveys. So all of that is basically individual level data. We would have N of about, I don't know, 4,000 or 5,000 in a given semester. And so it's longitudinal. So every week people respond to those questions, and we would have it. Some measures would be repeated, and then some of them would be qualitative, quantitative. So some are comments, some are actual, you know, on a 1 to 5 scale, or, you know, how old are you? So it would be a number. And so that would be, you know, obviously one of the levels. But then we would have a team level, and that one cannot really be put in the same file with the individual level because it's a whole different structure. So the team level would contain data such as, for example, evaluations of the team reports. And so obviously it's an inherently team level construct, and we can't really put it in the individual level other than maybe copying it like 7 times each time for each of the 7 team members. Or for example, team size. Again, like there is no easy way to fit it into the individual level data. Again, if you had, let's say, 7 people in the team, I suppose you can put, you know, team size 7 by each of those 7 people just because there are 7 of them. But it's a much more efficient way to handle, or much more accurate way, I guess, to handle it as a separate entity. So separate team level, you know, data file. And then the same thing, we have some data about instructors, and we have some data about universities. And even those are not the same entity because some universities have multiple instructors. Some instructors participate multiple times and they come from the same university, and sometimes they would switch schools and they would be, you know, same instructor but a different university now. So we had to separate that. And so we kept separating them by the level of analysis until we ended up with about 7 levels. But then even within that, we had to make some separations. Like, for example, when you look at the data at the individual level, some of them are, you know, your typical classic data like age, like gender, like whatever students say in the surveys. But some of them are comments, and those are either weekly comments, and sometimes people literally write, like a whole page or sometimes even more. In most cases, it's just a couple of sentences, but still sometimes it's a lot of text. And so Excel becomes very, very clumsy once you make it too big, but especially when you add a lot of text to some of the variables. And so because it's a fundamentally or qualitatively different type of data, eventually we separated that into a separate data entity, which we call comments. And then the same thing with the deliverables. As you know, every week students have to submit basically solutions or whatever they work on. So all those answers to the questions and the challenge. And again, in most cases, it's a lot of text. And so when we mixed it all together, the file became too big and it was just too hard to work with it. So we kind of separated that into a separate file. And so as a result, we ended up with all those, I believe at this time, 11 entities. And so here they are. And so for each of them, we have two files. We would have a code book and we would have the actual data file. And so let me open them very quickly and show to you what they look like. So let's look at the individual level, and it's the biggest one, and it will probably take like 2 minutes just to open, just because it's so big, the actual data file. So let me see if I found it. So I have like 4 screens connected to my computer, so I'll just, once it opens, I will move it so that you can see it on the main one. So the code book is the file that contains the list of all the variables, and it's sorted by the topic and then by the variable name, and then for each of those you have the abbreviated variable name, but you also have the actual question exactly the way it appears before the students' eyes when they answer the surveys. And then we also have some information on when it was measured, and sometimes it would be only once, but sometimes it would be every week, and so there would be a column there that shows how frequently and when the data were measured. We still have ways to improve that presentation. So at this time, it just simply separated by the comma and gives you the weeks when it was measured. But we're trying to build a more sophisticated system, which will use a matrix approach. And once it's ready, I'll show you how that works. But for now, let's look at the current system. So the code book. Very simple. The only big challenge with this file is that it's big. So I'm not sure how many of you tried to look at the data already, but if you did get to this file, to the individual level, you probably noticed that it takes like literally several hours just to read the list of the variables. And so if you want to go by the topic, that's much easier. It will give you a much faster preview of what we have. Like we have demographics, like age, gender, school, study level. Then we have some questions mainly alphabetically sorted. Like for example, we ask them, what do you think are the barriers or will be the challenges to the effective performance of your team? And so we have here expected and we have the actual, and so on and so on. And so I think it's like 1,200 variables that we have here at the individual level only. And so all of them are here. And other than that, it's a lot of text. There is really nothing, difficult about it. So you have the list of topics. You have a description as to what goes into that topic. You have the actual variable name, and then you have some explanation how it was measured or what was the question, and that's basically it. And then you have some information on the scale, like if it was 1 to 5, for example, or if it was just a number, and then, as I said, when it was measured. So it would be a specific week, and then it was measured. The only thing that I would like to add here is this part. So for some of the variables, you would have at the end this kind of ending that says at 3, at 4, at 5, at 6, and so on. And so if we have a repeated measure, what that is, it tells you in which week of the project that particular variable was measured. And so we experimented with so-called wide and long data shaping, so where we would put it all side by side or sometimes put it vertically. And those of you who are doing statistics a lot, you know that time series can be shaped, as we call it, wide and long. And so eventually we went with basically wide. So you have a separate column, one by another, for each of the measures. So if you have, for example, peer evaluations effort, it would be measured in week 3, and it would be one column. And then it's measured in week 4, and it's the column next to it. And so for some analysis, you may have to reshape it long, but that's a technicality. And if you know what I'm talking about, you will know how to do it. And if it's something that is strange to you, I guess no worries about that anyway, because it's not that important. So that's it. Now, the most important thing here is that once we get to the data file, it looks a little boring here. And let me hide these technical columns for now. We'll get to them later. So it looks kind of boring. So it's a gigantic data file with all of those variables and so on and so on and so on. But what's beautiful about this, if you insert a column here, and if you take your code book and you take this column with the variable name and paste it horizontally into the data file, it will be exactly the same collection of variables. So they go in exactly the same level. So if I copy it here and I paste it here and I select paste special transpose so that it flips 90 degrees, all of the data will be basically identical. So as you see, it's exactly the same order of variables. And so all you have to do to download the data, or if you don't want to download them themselves, you can do it, ask us and we'll do it for you. This is what you would do. You would go and, for example, say, okay, I want all of the demographics, and you just highlight it for yourself or for whoever will be doing that for you. And then let's say you would like to do the conflict resolution style. Okay, it seems like it's interesting. So you also highlight it, and you would, just do it like this. And then maybe you have another, like for example, you want leadership data. So let's say what you have. So here. So if you want to go one by one, you just copy the variable name here. You go to this file and you just look for it. Control F. Where is my Control F? And you put the variable here and you look for it, and it will come up right in a second. I should have highlighted only the headers row so that it's much faster, but it will do just fine. Yeah, so right here it is. So that's the one that you need. And then let's say, for example, you want to find another one. Let's say you would like to find this one, motivation level at week 4. So again, Control F. You put motivation level at week 4. Find next, and right here it is. So that's how you cross-locate each variable. If you would like to order the variables, so for example, if you would like me to or my assistant to get the variables for you, just highlight what you need, and then just like we did just a minute ago, you just copy the whole row and copy, go back to the file, go to the first one, paste special, transpose, and paste. And then when we scroll through the file, so all the variables that you wanted are now highlighted. So I see that you wanted age because it's highlighted. I see that you wanted, what's this here? Conflict resolution style, and it's highlighted, and so on and so forth. And I think we took leadership, and it's right here. So by simply highlighting the variables, it's the easiest way for us to select them for you. But technically, you don't really need that. So you have access to the actual data file, and you can just copy the whole file. It will be too big to do anything with it if you want to do some analysis like in SPSS or Stata or even in Excel. So I recommend first deciding on what you need and then deleting everything else. Like literally, I would go F12 and then save S, save it as a separate file on my somewhere desktop or whatever folder you do, and then literally just delete everything that you don't need for your analysis. And so, but deleting lots of variables, you will make the file much more manageable. So when you, in SPSS or Stata, when you try to do some analysis and look at the list of variables, you don't have to go and look for the one that you need. You'll just have like 50 or 100 left, whatever the number. So, and that's the same thing for all the other levels. So it's exactly the same for the team level. Let me just close this one. So if you open, for example, team level, the team code book is much smaller because at the team level we have much less variables. So we have like team size, % male, some basic characteristics like distribution and distances and stuff like that. And I'll remove all the highlights. I'm not sure, somebody must have been working with it and made the changes. But yeah, you have about 100 or so variables at the team level. And again, you can just highlight them here. And if you go to the data file, it will be again much smaller because it's much less variables, and it's the same thing. So it will be in exactly the same order, and it will be same approach. So for example, let's say you would like the variable called I don't know, team size. So you just go here and you look for team size, and it should come up right here. Yeah, right here. Yeah, team size 7, 8, whatever the number of people. And so over these years, we had about 10,000 teams, and yeah. Now, when you will be merging the data together, you will be using the team ID or term ID, depending on which way you want to merge them. So when you go, I should have not closed the individual level data. So when you go to the individual level file, you will see exactly the same codes. So you will have the same team ID and you will have the term ID. And it's basically a combination of the year, semester, track, and team number. And so if you ever wanted to, somebody's microphone. Yeah, okay. So let's see if the file has opened.
Can you hear me now?
Yep, I
Yes,
got
you
you.
can.
Okay.
Yeah. So while my individual level file is still opening, yeah. So once it's open, I'll show you the respondent IDs. But again, if you ever wanted to merge the files together, for example, if you wanted to do some sort of either multi-level analysis, or if you would like to, for example, generalize the team size to the individual level, you would use the team ID variable as that matching variable. And then you can either manually match them, or you can use VLOOKUP in Excel. And if you don't know how to use VLOOKUP, just there are thousands of videos on YouTube, like a 1-minute explanation how to use VLOOKUP. Or if you use SPSS or Stata, they actually have built-in commands for that specific purpose. So when you go to the individual level file, you will have here student ID, which is, again, as I said, it's the year, semester, track, team number, and then the student number in that team. But then you also have the team ID, and it's the same team ID as in the team file. So for example, if you would like to find people from this team in the individual file, you just copy the team ID, you go to team ID and look for it here, and you can go even find all, and as you see, 6 people come up. So those are the people from team 50 from 2015 1B. So all of them are here. So that's basically it. Now there is one thing that is a complicating factor, and so I'm still not sure how to best deal with it as far as presentation of the data. And that is not every variable has been measured every semester. And so the challenge that presents is this. When you look at the individual data codebook, you may look at, let's say, for example, you find several variables that you like. Let's say, for example, you have oh, that's instructor, sorry. I opened the wrong codebook, just 1 second. Individual codebook. So for example, you look at the data and let's say you decided to correlate, let's say, this cultural value item with, for example, cultural background. And in this case, let's say how many cultures you identify with. And you would like to see if people who score high on this item, whatever it is, achievement orientation, if they come from multiple cultures. And you look in the codebook and you see, okay, it seems like they have this variable and this variable. Oh, this is wonderful, so I can correlate them. The problem is that it's not a guarantee that they were measured in the same semester. So it is possible that we measured this one only in, let's say, 2 years, like 2015, 2016, for example. And this one was measured only in 2017, for example. In most cases, all of the variables are measured in most semesters. So usually it would be no problem here. But sometimes it happens that you would have 2 variables in the codebook, but once you get the actual data, you realize that this one was only in 2015 and this one was only in, let's say, 2017. And that's the challenge. And I'm still not sure how to represent it here. So what we will probably do is populate this matrix here with some sort of ones or x's that will show in which semester the data were measured. So it would look something like this. Like, for example, this one was measured here. And this one was measured, for example, here. And so that way you will know that both of them, I mean, and then this one, let's say, was measured here. And not at all. And so in this case, you will say, okay, so we have 2 years or 2 semesters or 4 semesters when the data were measured at the same time, so I can do the correlation. But for example, in this semester, it was only this one that was measured, but not the other one. And so that way you will hopefully see right away when they were measured. It's still easy to see once you go to the actual data file. And so once you scroll down, you will see that some variables just were not measured. Like, for example, whatever we used to talk here about, like used coaches. So did you use a coach? We didn't use coaches up until 2016, so that's why it was empty in the first tracks. So only now we actually use them. But that's the challenge. So sometimes you'll have to actually look at the data first to make sure that you have the variables that you're interested in coming from the same semester, from the same students. The rest is pretty much self-explanatory. So you have access to all the data files, complete data files. You have the access to the code books, and that's probably where you need to start. During the hackathon, I'll have my assistant available more or less 24/7, or at least during the business hours. And so you can download the data yourself and then delete the variables that you don't need and use the ones that you do need. But I know that it still may be overwhelming. It's still a lot of data. And so in that case, you can just ask my assistant to help you with that. It may be always a good idea to ask not for specific variables, but instead to ask for constructs. And the reason for that is that it's not always easy to label variables and constructs with names that are fully encompassing the construct and universally understood. And so sometimes what happens is, let's say you would like to measure, I don't know, motivation or grit. And so you look at the variables, and the one that you need doesn't, like, there is no variable with that same name. And so you may think, oh, okay, maybe they didn't measure it. But if you give us the construct that you need, my assistant has been working with those data for a long time. I have been working with those data for a long time. And I can tell you, oh, actually, you know what, we do have something like that. So it may appear under a slightly different name, but when you look at the actual question, that would be what you need. Or vice versa. Sometimes you may think, okay, we have here a variable named, I don't know, emotional intelligence, and you think, okay, that's what I would like to use. But then again, if you tell us that you would like emotional intelligence for whatever reason, sometimes I may recognize that actually the one that we have here may not be most, best suited for that, because, for whatever reason it was measured slightly differently and actually stands for something completely different. So, so therefore, when you ask for the data, it would be most efficient if you already select the specific variables. That makes our job easier to select them for you. But as I said, it's always a good idea to just give us some description of the constructs you need. And so in that case, we will be able to help you select the right variables, not to miss anything relevant, and maybe then correct you if you selected something that you thought is suitable, but in reality, it may not necessarily be suitable for whatever you need. So, but yeah, the rest as far as the data is fairly simple. So now let me switch my computer, my screen, and and switch my camera, and let me see if you have any questions about what we just discussed. Or maybe even some comments or suggestions. All your microphones are muted, I see, so if you're saying something, we don't hear you. Anyone?
Initially, I started working on this entry mode selection by students, and how the culture, especially Hofstede's uncertainty avoidance would influence these people's decisions. But later on, when I came to the closed group, then I learned that Ramya also working on the same topic. So yeah, right. So we will see how far she has gone, and if both of us are going in the same direction, probably I can join with her or with other like-minded people. Or if both our objectives and goals are different, probably I can take my own paper differently. Yep. My initial thought process was that how cultural background will influence the entry mode suggestion. Do you want to do this? Does the student want to take a very safe and a safe approach, or they are willing to go and up to the direct investment, foreign direct investment, where the risk taking is very, very high, or just they wanted to export or license or whatever it is. Then a second paradigm I was looking at is there any way to bring in John Dunning's OLI paradigm? So that's what. So if that's what my ideas are, then how do you think I can pull the data from our data set?
Okay, so let's take a look and try to pull out data for this study. And this is a perfect example because it's a little complicated, not necessarily very straightforward. And so we'll use that as an example. So let me switch again to my screen so you can see what I'm looking at. And so let's try to select those data. So here we have a very interesting idea that the personal values, particularly with respect to uncertainty avoidance, may affect the entry mode or the choice of the entry mode. And so I assume the hypothesis is that if uncertainty avoidance is high, people will choose low-risk entry modes such as exporting, or maybe some sort of like a joint venture where the local partner will take a lot of responsibility, as opposed to those who have a low uncertainty avoidance.
Absolutely.
Making something more risky, like wholly owned subsidiary, perhaps, or something that requires greater involvement. And so uncertainty avoidance, so here with the first variable, we are in luck. So we actually do have a variable specifically called uncertainty avoidance, and let's try to look for it. So uncertainty, so I'll just go low. So I effectively handle uncertainty. So we have handle uncertainty, cultural intelligence, potentially relevant. So, but not quite clear if it's a cultural value per se. So let's keep looking. In fact, I'll go like this. So we have 10 cells with uncertainty avoidance. Okay, so here we have cultural values at individual level of measurement. And we actually have a variable that is specifically called uncertainty anxiety. And so let's read the item. If I'm uncertain about a responsibility of a job, I get very anxious. So that seems like a very good one. And let's see if we have anything else. So basically all of those that have UA here, that's the uncertainty avoidance, right? So, and when we look at the instructions, description, detailed instructions and guidance are preferred on the job, blah, blah, blah. So it seems like a good one, and that it looks like it's repeated in several weeks. So we may not need all of them. When we look at, at 1, at 8, and it's a slightly different one again at 1. So we probably will not need it multiple times, but then again, it's probably that in one semester it was measured in week 1, and in one semester it was measured in week 8. So we'll have to look at that. But it looks like we have a total of 7 items for uncertainty avoidance, and some of them may be repeated. So therefore we'll probably have like 5 or 6 total unique items. And so let me just to be sure, let me see what else we have for uncertainty avoidance, just to make sure that we didn't miss anything. So we have this one from cultural intelligence. I probably would stay away from it. Again, tolerance of uncertainty. There is another one. We might want to take it just, in case we need it in the future, but I would stay with the ones that are specifically cultural variables. And it seems like that's all we have, all we need on uncertainty avoidance, right? Now, when it comes to the other variable here, entry mode decisions, that is an individual level variable because that's what people told us individually in weekly deliverables. But as I mentioned earlier, we put the deliverables in a separate file. So it would be hard to, for someone new to think about that, but, I'm telling you now and you will know in the future. And I'll obviously remind you again in the future in case the question of that kind will come along, but it would be in the file called deliverables. And again, if we go in the code book, we will look at entry mode, and let's see if we can find it very easily. And I think it actually does appear specific under that name. So exactly right here. So we have entry mode, and we have the choice of the entry mode. So it would be like a specific code, specific word, and then we have an explanation. And so that's the key variables. The only other thing that I would add to this is controls. Always remember about the controls. So for example, you will probably want to check if the relationship between the cultural values and entry mode decision is, I don't know, affected or changes or moderated by, let's say, for example, the level of studies of the person. Is it MBA versus undergraduate? Maybe MBAs make right choices no matter what their cultural values are, and maybe undergraduates are more affected by their values and go with whatever the emotions tell them rather than I don't know, the actual knowledge. So in that case, I would actually go and include at least the demographics as my controls. I would probably control for age, gender, study level. I'm not sure if you need to control for the school that the person comes from. So things like that. Maybe eventually you'll decide something else, but for now, let's decide that those are the 3 that we need. And so again, you can go just one by one and go to the data file and select them one by one. So we would have our, for example, age, and we'll highlight it for now so we know that we want to take it. And then, for example, once we get to uncertainty avoidance, let me see if I can quickly find it without looking up. So it would be uncertainty avoidance. And I think it comes with this, yeah. And all of them are here. So we have all of those uncertainty avoidance variables, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So they would be all here. And then whatever else we might need from this file. And as you see, some of these items were asked in semester 1, only like 2 of them. Then for some semesters, we had pretty much all of them. Then again, there was only 1. We didn't measure it for a long time. And then it looks like we actually measured it only in 2013, 2014. So only in a couple of years. So that's potentially a challenge because, as I said, let's see if the entry mode is available for those years. So we have 2013, 2014. So then we'll go to the data file for the deliverables. And so we have deliverables codebook, but that's the actual data. And we'll take, again, a little time to open because it's a lot of text. And let's see if we can find entry mode right away. Entry. So entry mode is right here. Two of them are here. And so let's see where we have the data. Yeah, so we have here licensing, joint venture, and we are actually in luck because we do have 2014 as well. So it seems like there will be at least a couple of semesters when both uncertainty avoidance was measured as well as the entry mode. So, and we can then literally just code entry mode for the, let's say, risk, for example, and see if there is a correlation or not. And so what I would do, just to merge it into a single file, I would do this, this and this, copy, Control-N to open a new file, and paste as values. So here we have our student ID, and we have entry mode. Now, the next part will be a little trickier. So you need to add to this file the data from your cultural intelligence. And let me show you how I would do it. But again, those of you who are proficient with SPSS, R, or Stata, there may be an even easier way to do it. So what I would do is I would go to the individual data, and just a second, right here, and we would need, let's say, to add these variables to the list. So what I would do is I would use the VLOOKUP function, and if you will find that a little overwhelming now, don't worry. As I said, there are a lot of videos on YouTube that show you how to use it. And if you forget, you can always just look up VLOOKUP, what it does. So it's what's so-called vertical lookup. So I would type the function called vertical lookup, and I would look up by the student ID in this array all the way until I get to the, probably should have copied first. You know what I'll do is, well, let's keep doing this. So until I get, so here my uncertainty avoidance. So that would be columns, let me try to do it one more time because I didn't notice the name of the column when I switched to the mode. So let me do it one more time. Should be not too far. The good news is, again, if you're looking at me now and like, what is he doing? You don't have to worry about that. As I said, if you tell me what you need, myself or my assistant will prepare those data for you.
Okay.
And let me just do it one more time because I unclicked before. So I'm looking at those numbers. As you see in the corner there, we have the numbers moving all the time as I'm moving to the right. And I need those numbers to do the VLOOKUP. Okay. So I need VLOOKUP from 2001-36 all the way to 2020, whatever that number is. So VLOOKUP 1002-36 false as the function. Okay, yeah, I must have gotten the numbers wrong. Let me do it the other way around. So let me just do this instead. So I'll do this, put the data here. I'll do the student ID, put the data, oops, put the data here. So now I have my cultural intelligence data here. And now I would like to copy into this my my entry mode data. And entry mode data comes from here. So that should be very easy. So I'm going to entry mode, put it here, and then we'll do the VLOOKUP. So I'd like to look up by the student ID from this file, and I need columns 14 and 15. So column 14 false, and it was not available for this semester. And then 15 false. And then I just copy it all the way down. And so as we go down, so we didn't measure. strange why all of them are, because we did have some. Must have made a mistake in the formula somewhere. Let me do this. So instead of torturing you with this mathematical stuff, as I said, we will select the data for you. If you need to match them from different levels, we will match them for you from different levels. We will use this VLOOKUP, and I have no idea why it's not working at this particular time. Let me check one more time if I went by the student ID or by the team ID. Maybe I looked. Just 1 second. Let me try to do it one more time very quickly. So VLOOKUP, we want to go student ID 1415. So why did it not work? False. Thinking. Okay, here it is. So now the data came. So I must have made an error in the formula the first time. Let me just copy this here. And let me see if we are lucky enough to have the data from the same semester, because it's possible that it's not overlapping. Particular study, there is a different solution, which I will give in a second. Okay. So yeah, so we have the data, but it looks like cultural intelligence, uncertainty avoidance was measured up until 2013 to be, and then so no luck as far as the data overlaps. So the entry mode was measured in a different semester. What we would do at this time, we would then check several more things. One, we will check if we don't have any other uncertainty avoidance data. Maybe they appeared, like for example, here we have 2014 where we have only one item, and I have no idea why it's only one item. Normally we would measure more, but maybe it was just a semester when we just had one. And so at least for 2014, we have some measure of uncertainty avoidance, and we have the entry mode, and then we have the explanation why they selected it. But I would think that we would have more of that. Let me see where else we have uncertainty avoidance. And why is it keeping coming up as just one single item? So that may take some work on my end to first make sure that there is no error in what I just did. If it turns out that there is no error, then this study may be impossible because uncertainty avoidance and entry modes were measured at different times. We do have, it looks like, at least some of the items in the same semesters. The challenge here is that we would like to have uncertainty avoidance measured multiple items, and for some reason we have only one item. So the reliability issue or the reliability concern could be an issue, but we'll have to take and investigate it a little further. So, but from what we see so far, we would be able to do it for 2014 too, with one uncertainty avoidance item and then the entry mode. So we have something, but it may not be perfect. So that's basically where we are with this one. For entry modes and deliverables, there is one more thing that I should say here, and again, that's something we will help you with. In some semesters, the questions in deliverables were specifically labeled as questions, like it would be, entry mode, or it would be, for example, marketing, or it would be whatever the challenge was, HR. But then as the challenges became more and more different from one another in a given semester, we would often have in the deliverables file, instead of the actual name of the deliverable, we would actually have just the name section. So we would have, like, instead of the actual entry mode, we would have, like, for example, section 1, section 2, like here, like select 1, select 2, and stuff like that. And so sometimes we may have to take a closer look as to what was section 1, section 2 in that particular semester to decide if it's something that we can still use. And so we may still be able to salvage some data by looking at the actual assignments and see what went into each section and maybe get some of those data. That way, will take me like half an hour to do that investigation and see if we can get data that way. So, but that's what we would do here. Hopefully that's not too depressing, because it seems like for this particular study, we may not have the best data because of that mismatch across the semesters. Yeah. Any other quick, maybe anyone has a simpler study in mind that we can try to look up the data quickly? So,
Vas,
yes.
I had a clarification.
Yes.
So in team codebook, there were some variables which have been grayed out.
Which has been what? Erased?
Some variables have been grayed out. They are marked in gray color in team codebook.
Yes, yeah, I should remove that coding, but yeah, that one. So those are calculated variables. Let me again show you very quickly what they are, and I probably should have not used the color to avoid confusion. Let me close them. I will close the files because it looks like now that I have all those Excel files open, it's consuming all my memory and.
Yeah, I do see something about geographic distance.
Right. So
diversity.
Those are calculated. Diversity variables, and the reason we grade them out, and again I should remove that. So since they're calculated, they are not kind of. Well, let me just open it so we look at the same files. So one more second. Let me share the screen. Okay, I'll go here, switch off my video. So you see the screen, right? So when we go to the team level data, we did a number of studies. You can see my screen, right?
Yes.
So we did a number of studies on the effects of what we call distance in teams on teams' performance and stuff. And so we wanted to calculate and know, for example, how diverse the team is in terms of the number of countries represented, the average geographic distance between the team members, the average distance in kilometers and stuff like that. And so for a few semesters, we would calculate those variables. Like, for example, to calculate the number of countries on the team, that was easy. You just basically count the number of teams. But when it comes to, for example, average geographic distance, that required some calculation. So let's say if you have 7 people, you would have whatever the number of possible pairs. And so you would basically calculate, a distance between each 2 people in the team, and then you average it. So, maybe between some people are like 1,000 kilometers apart, some people are 3,000 kilometers apart, and so on and so on. So once you take all those all those distances and average them, you get your average geographic distance. The same thing for the time zone distance. Again, some people are in the same time zone, so the difference will be 0. Some people may be like 5 hours apart, and so the distance will be 5, and we would calculate the distance. And so for a while, we've been calculating them manually at the end of each semester. It takes some time, and I think the formula is somewhere here, or at least we explain how it was done, in terms of the steps. And so we did it, one by one. I think that the formulas, so links to how it was calculated and explanations are here. But then the problem with that approach is that first, it takes time. Second, people calculate those distances in different ways. And eventually the decision has been made not to do those calculations by default, but basically just provide the raw data. And because we know the location of each team member each time, and we know what country they come from, those who need can calculate it themselves. And so that's why we put it in gray, meaning that it was available for some semester, it was calculated. We probably will recalculate it at some point for all the subsequent semesters because it's needed so frequently. But at the same time, just to know that it was, phased out in a sense, I guess for the internal reasons, we put them in gray. And so I probably should have not done that because it probably creates more confusion than, helps. But that's the story behind those distance variables here. So we had, as I said, diversity variables here, distance, time zone, and geographic distance. And so they're calculated, must have been for at least, several years, but we haven't done it for the last few years. So that's the story there.
And also in the same, if you scroll down, there are some report eval variables. I just wanted to understand what were those.
Yeah, so again,
some extra report.
Yeah, it seems like my assistant, as he was trying to clean the variables, so he used some coding, so that was something that we don't need here. So yeah, so report evaluations, the same thing. So we have a whole bunch of variables here related to report evaluations. And so the report evaluations, that's what the instructors do at the end of the semester. As you know, we all receive a bunch of reports, and the job is to evaluate them on whatever dimensions we evaluate them. The reason we have so many of them is because the coding scheme or evaluation scheme has changed over time. So I believe the first time we did it, it was just one number. Then we had a separate evaluation for different questions within the report, and they would go by the topic. And then at some point, the last few years, we just went section 1, section 2, section 3, and so on. And in different challenges, different sections pertained to a different question. So in most cases, they followed more or less the same structure, but sometimes for some reports, section 3 would be a question about logistics. In another challenge, it would be about HR. In yet another one, it would be something about product development. And so instead of trying to label them each time for what they are, we just say section 1, section 2, section 3. And so that's the scheme we use lately. But because they changed from semester to semester, we would add a separate set of basically variables columns. And so when you look at the team data, you will see that when it comes to report evaluations, like this first approach, we would have it a lot in the early semesters. Like for example, this one, whichever method that was, let me just remove this filter. Whichever method it was, like novelty of the report, feasibility rating, clarity, whatever it was. So we did it only in the first semester, and then we stopped doing it. And then in 2013, we switched to this method. So report executive summary and whatever else it is here. And then the last one with those sections 1, section 2, and I think that would be here. Executive summary, section 1, section 2. So we didn't use it in the early semesters, but use it in the late semesters. So once we get to 2016, that's the method we use now. And so potentially you can try to merge them. So like, for example, if section 2 corresponds to, let's say, I don't know, entry mode, you can find literally entry mode from the earlier semesters and try to merge them. But again, for the clarity and cleanness of the data, we keep them separate, at least for now. And so that's how it goes. And in most cases, people would only need the final evaluation, the report average, and it would be here, and I think it's the same for pretty much all of the semesters. But yeah, that's why we have so many report evaluation columns. So it would be in a given semester, it's usually about 10 dimensions. But because they changed from a year to year, you would have like these 10 were used in year 1, 2, 3, or whatever years we're talking about. And then these 10 were used in the next 2 years. And then these 10 are used now or in the last 10 years. So that's what we have. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Let me put it this way. You're all very quiet. When people see these databases the first time, if they don't have any experience with database management, they just become depressed and they say, I don't know what to do with them. If they have experience with database management, and they actually think that they can do it better, then in many cases they become angry. And they would often come back to me and they would say something like, who created this stuff? I mean, this is this is just bad. You have to redo it. And then inevitably one thing happens. So they start working with the file and they say, well, if you have ideas for how to improve it, they start working with the file and they say, you know what, actually, no, that's actually a very good way to do it. I don't think it's there is a better way to do it. And so we had, like, for example, Justin Kramer, who was working on this for like 2 years, I guess, now. So he's been trying to streamline. And then we had a guy who was specifically hired to do it. He was a database manager. And so in the end, everybody comes to the conclusion that it's depressing and overwhelming, not because it's a bad structure, but because it's just a lot of data. And so once you want to present all of that, all those different entities, there is no way to make it in a very, very simple way. Like, there is no way to just have one single file with a list of variables and that's it. So you have to have those different entities. And sometimes, as I said, some variables were measured in 1 year and not measured in another. So you'll have some missing cells. And sometimes, the variable name, whichever way you name it, it's going to be a little confusing or not always, a perfect name. That's just the reality. So if you work with big data sets like the World Value Survey, it's exactly the same reaction initially, and then you familiarize yourself. The good news is, as I said, you don't have to worry about how to deal with that. So over time, once you start using it for a while, you will become comfortable with this stuff, and you will know how to, find the variables, how to extract them. So it shouldn't be a problem, and it will become very simple and very easy. But at least in the beginning, as I said, as long as you give me the list of things that you need, my assistant, and if needed, we will select those variables for you, and we'll give you a data file, Excel file, with only the data that you need. So if you need only cultural values and entry mode, That's what we'll extract, plus maybe add a few control variables, and it will be a nice and clean and manageable neat file. And so that's something you can work with. It's not that difficult to do if you know how to do it, but as I said, it may be a little overwhelming if you haven't done it before, especially if you don't have experience with this particular data set. But as I said, the good news is you don't have to do it. As long as you tell us what you needed, it shouldn't take more than a couple of hours of extraction of data, and we'll have somebody to do it for you.
Great.
So do you want to share maybe quickly before we go, do you have any specific ideas for studies that you have in mind already that you think you would like to work on? That will give us first some ideas for, what kind of data we may extract in the future. And then at the same time, just to get an idea of, what people work on. So anyone?
Let's see, is my microphone working? Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
I am really interested in the diversity, the team diversity. So going back, you haven't calculated it for all the years. Can we use the years that are calculated, or are those kind of taken by someone else?
We had a lot of years when we calculated diversity, and so we had several measures. So obviously you can have the number of countries. That one is very easy to obtain. So even if it was not calculated specifically, it's a very simple, formula in Excel that, you just get it. So that's easy. But then we also had all kinds of other diversity measures. So we had, for example, things like, there is this, it comes from biology, but it's so one of them is Van der Zee, I guess is the name of the guy. The other one is, I believe, Hoover or something like that. And those are formulas that calculate the diversity within the country by the nationality, but they use a more complicated formula than just the number of countries, because if you have the number of countries, you can have, let's say you have 10 people, and let's say 5 come from one country and 5 come from another country, and so that will give you a number 2. But then let's say you have 9 people from one country and 1 person from another country. It's still a 2, but it's not capturing that, that dispersion. So the formula there is a little bit more complicated, and it kind of takes into account all those majorities and stuff like that. And in most cases, it's 1 when every single individual is from a different country, 0 or 1, everyone is from a different country, 0, everyone from the same country, and then everything in between depending on those combinations. And so the formula is relatively simple, but it takes, multiple steps to calculate it. And so we didn't do the calculations ever since we finished that particular study. But again, it's doable. And if needed, if you need that specific formula, we can easily do that. So it's kind of almost like similar to standard deviation, just works with nominal values.
Okay.
So, but then you can look at other types of diversity, like, for example, cultural diversity. Again, it can be something like, so we tried several formulas, I believe 6 to be exact. And eventually we found that the correlation among those formulas was virtually 1, like almost perfect, like 0.97. And so if you use standard deviation, it gives you basically the same measure of diversity. And the good thing about standard deviation is that it's embedded in Excel formulas. And so when you wanted to look, for example, let's say age diversity, so you have the age right there. And if you wanted to look at age diversity, so what you can do is just simply calculate the standard deviation for the team. And it gives you a very nice, neat diversity measure. It may not be what they call the average intra-member distance, but it's essentially the same mathematically. It's the average square root of the average squared distance. And so mathematically, it's slightly different, but gives you exactly the same correlations. Likewise, let's say you would like to look at cultural diversity. So for example, uncertainty avoidance, how similar or different they are. Again, you have the actual values for the team, and then you just get the standard deviation. That's it. And so you got all the numbers right there. And again, we can calculate them for you. That's very easy to do, or you can calculate it yourself. So not a big deal. So the only ones that are tricky really are geographic distance and time zones. And the reason those are tricky is because as I said, you have to work like with 2. With the time zone distance, it's still possible. For each team member, you can just give the number distance from Greenwich, for example, and then just take the average of that or standard deviation of that. So that's easy. But when it gets to the geographic distance, that becomes a little difficult because it's, like you literally have to deal with the pairs. And it's a somewhat painful task, takes some time, no easy way to calculate it automatically. But if needed, we can calculate that too. So we do have the formulas, and shouldn't take more than an hour, once you know what's the measure you need it for.
Okay. So I'm interested in cultural national diversity and the impact on the entry mode. I think that Rami and I were interested in that. Maybe Raj, we could work together on that. I'm also interested in gender diversity in the process, more of the socio-affective processes within, how motivated they are, how much participation during the project.
Yeah, that's a very good idea. We have all those data again with the gender diversity. If I may, again, it comes up from time to time. This one is a very tricky variable, and the reason it's very tricky is because how do you operationalize it? So technically, you can use, and we already have it in the calculations there, percent male. So and let's say percent male is 50. That means that you have half and half, kind of diverse. But then again, it's a little, doesn't capture the whole story in a sense. And so we also tried, like, for example, and you can calculate it yourself if needed, like we tried to take the distance from 50-50. So if you have, for example, 80% male, 20% female, the distance is like 30%. Like basically there are different ways to operationalize that variable, but essentially you will have, like ultimately it's a simple number, percent men. And or you can take percent women, and so it would be either all male or female. But as I said, if you take the distance from 50-50, then you would have, like for example, 0.5 when it's either all male or all female.
Right.
And you have 0 if it's 50-50, or you can do it the other way around. Whereas if you take percent male, then you can have like 0 and 1, so which is very different numbers, but essentially mean that everybody is of the same gender. So, but yeah, it's in any case, those are simple mathematical calculations. It's just something that we struggled with when we dealt with gender diversity ourselves, just because it was not clear how to, like, is it percent male or is it something different? So, yeah. But yeah, so.
Sorry, when you asked the question about envy.
Which one?
Sorry, when you asked the question about envy, it kind of made me think of a possible study, but I haven't articulated it well yet. I'm not sure. But if there's some sort of sabotage, if there is a student on the team if there were a Latino person and mostly living in the U.S. Let's say there's a Mexican American in the U.S.
Okay.
I'm assuming that person wants to become Americanized.
Mm-hmm.
Some sabotage, if there's some sort of feeling of superiority, if there's some sort of, I don't know, negative feeling toward the Latinos in the Latin American country, or I don't know, if an Eastern European studying in Western Europe has some sort of negative feeling that would be reflected in the peer evaluation for people from his original country.
So you're talking here about so all those kind of biases or prejudice as the effect on the entry mode, or as the effect on the peer evaluation?
Probably on peer evaluation.
Yeah. So this one,
a bias against his own roots.
Yeah, that would be very interesting. So we kind of looked at that at some time, didn't really push it to the level where it's a developed paper, but we did have a study or kind of have ongoing where we wanted to look at what affects peer evaluation. And so there were all kinds of different, factors that we wanted to look at, and we looked also at all kinds of different peer evaluation styles, from things like, being more harsh in evaluations, kind of giving them lower versus being more lenient, but also looked at things like, for example, being more differentiating. Some people give everyone the same number, others give some high numbers and some low numbers, or being more differentiating on the dimensions of peer evaluation. Some people would give you, like, let's say 5 on intellectual capabilities, but maybe 3 on friendliness. And others, if I like you, I'll give you 5 on everything. And if I don't like you, I'll give you, like, let's say 2 or 3 on everything. And so there were a couple of, a number of those, styles. And so one of the hypotheses was that maybe in our case, we thought the other way around. So we thought maybe there would be some sort of like a collusion going on. So if we both are from China, then we'll each give each other, best grades, even if one of them is a Chinese in America and the other one is Chinese in China. So, or Ukrainians, for example, we come from the same country, so I'll give you 5 no matter what. But so that was the hypothesis, and we never acted on that. And so we can definitely look at it. The only question is we need to think about how we will operationalize that prejudice. So we can definitely see who is from what country and who gave whom what peer evaluations. But the bigger question will be, how do we know that those differences are due to some sort of a bias or prejudice? We can look at things like, for example, we ask questions like, how different or similar do you think are the cultures of people represented on your team? And maybe, people who see themselves different, maybe they're a little bit more, prejudiced. Or how confident are you that you will be able to complete the task with people from these countries? And again, maybe, that level of self-efficacy will be indicative of, how positively or negatively biased they are. And even we have questions like, how motivated are you to work with people from these cultures? And again, I guess that potentially can be some sort of a proxy for bias. I'm not sure if we ever asked directly, like, do you like this culture or country? There was one semester we had a student, and that goes back to James's question. There was a student from the Netherlands who did a PhD on what she said, how psychic distance affects country choice. And so she wanted to see if people choose to enter the countries that they like, or they actually use economic analysis. And so what we did in that semester, before the project started, before people even were placed on teams, we asked them which countries they like. Basically, do you like, what are your favorite countries? And people would often select like countries like France, like something cool, or Switzerland. And then we would look at what countries they actually advocated as the entry choice market for their company. And so in many cases, we saw that there was a positive correlation, meaning that people in many cases apparently just go to the countries that they always liked and always wanted to be in, as opposed to where there is a market. But in your case, maybe we can look at those, countries they like and don't like, and see if there may be some sort of, like if somebody says, I don't like, let's say, I don't know, Mexico, and then there's a student from Mexico on the team, and that student consistently gets lower evaluations. Maybe there is something going on there as far as, cultural bias, as opposed to actually lower performance of that student. So it will be a little difficult to extract all of that because we may not have matches all the time, but I'm sure we'll have at least a few hundred cases where it's a nice, clean, separation, so we can analyze them. So I'm kind of hoping that most of you will go with simpler stuff. So you have, but you all go to different entities, but it shouldn't be a problem. We can, it shouldn't take more than an hour or so each time to match the data from different data sets. What might help though, given that all the questions that come so far are for data from different entities, it may actually be a good idea if you have something in mind, if you send already the list of constructs that you think you need. So this way I will put the guy in Ukraine who works with the data, so he can start preparing your data set so that they're ready even before we come there. Because each time it may take an hour or so to prepare, maybe even 2 hours if it's a more complicated story. And then there will be 20 of us or so at the hackathon. And so we may literally spend the first whole day just waiting for the data, and we don't want that. So maybe, especially if your data, if you think you may need the data from different entities, maybe it would be a good idea. Just 1 second. Just 1 second, I'm on the call here. I'll scroll by it. Yes. So it may be a good idea to send the list of constructs you need upfront so that we can maybe prepare at least some of those data sets in ahead of time. And if eventually it turns out that we need more variables, it will be easier just to add a few variables to the existing data set than to create it from scratch. In fact, please do send your initial list of constructs. I guess it will be, at the very least, it will be a good exercise for him trying to, to generate lots of data sets. And even if you come up with a whole different idea 2 days later, at least he will have a little bit more practice and will hopefully come up with those data sets faster. Yeah.
Has there been any studies with perspective? Particular team as a TMT, top management team making the strategic.
That top management team is a tricky one. Again, it comes up from time to time. The question is, who are the top managers? We have ideas for studies, and maybe you can take a lead on that, on how that professor affects student performance. You can kind of assume that the professor is, in a sense, a manager here or a boss. But the challenge with that is that each team is comprised of people from different classes. And so each one has essentially a different boss. And those bosses do not really communicate with one another, so they're not really a team. So they just happen to be 7 different professors in different countries. So that is tricky. And then on the other hand, you can look at some teams that have a formally elected leader, or sometimes even 2 leaders, and maybe use that as a potentially top management. But again, it would be a little tricky here. So we would have about a third of the team. So we'll have at least a few hundred each semester that have a formally elected leader. And I guess you can treat that as a top management team, but I'm not sure if it's exactly the same construct as what you would call top management team in a company. So that's, you know, one tricky here. So what do you mean when you say top management team?
Yeah, I thought I can consider the entire team as the top management team because they are collectively responsible for making a strategic decision.
Right, right. Well,
so if I can look at all the top management team characteristics, like of all the members, and I look at age, background, cultural, cultural background, and several other education or location. I mean, not location, different kinds of influences on their thinking,
yeah,
and then try to see how they have arrived at this strategic decision. And is it possible to look at that entire team as an from an upper echelon's perspective? Because they are not making just an operational decision; they are making a strategic decision for a company and making a recommendation. So I want to look at it from a strategic decision-making perspective by a top management team. So
maybe that's a good idea to select the teams that have a formally elected leader. And as I said, about 1/3 of the teams do have a formally elected leader. And then, you know, out of 7 people, there will be 1 or maybe 2 people who act as leaders, and you can then look at their characteristics and see how that affects the team dynamics or team decisions or team performance. So we would have that as a leadership. I guess that's the closest you can get to you know, top management team. So as I said, it may not be exactly the same construct as what we call top management team in a company, but I guess, you know, you can still look at the effects of leadership and management on the team itself.
Call it senior leadership team and include the whole team.
Yeah, but as I said, think about looking in the future at the effects of the senior management team as the professors, and how those, you know, it would have to be probably done at the level of class as opposed to at the level of the team. But it would be a fascinating study, and I bet it will be a very strong effect that the qualifications and the attitudes and the characteristics of the professor, and then how his students perform in the project. So I bet that the professors who are, you know, more responsible, more diligent, more timely, that their students will be the same. So once you look at their performance, the students will probably get better peer evaluations, write better reports and stuff like that. And so in that respect, I think we can treat it as a, you know, professors being the top managers, students being essentially employees, and the employees work in all kinds of teams, you know, with other employees from other organizations, but still you will see some sort of a relationship between the professor and the student performance. And we do have a lot of data on professor performance. Yeah.
Sure.
All right, so then, as I said, if you send me, and I encourage you to send me the list of constructs that you think you will need, that will speed up the process with the data generation, so that you have something before before we actually meet. And then we may amend it with additional variables if in the course of the discussion you will realize that you need more. But I think that might help us. So that will save us some time and just sitting and waiting for the data. All right, well, thank you so much. So I'm stopping the recording.